Welcome to our channel. In the war between Ukraine and Russia, the difference between the values of the leaders of both countries is revealed. While Vladimir Putin is trying to force his influence on his army, people, generals, and parliament, Zelensky as a whole is marching towards victory with all the Ukrainians, with supreme effort and confident steps, and even amazes the Russian soldiers and people. When we look at the pathetic state of Putin, who is shown today as the most charismatic leader of the last 10 years, he took the biggest gamble of his life and put his country on an irreversible path. Russian citizens who find themselves in the middle of chaos with the mobilization decision announced throughout Russia are quite uneasy. On the same day that Vladimir Putin announced his decision to mobilize, Russian military candidates and generally the male population began to leave Russia. Hundreds of thousands of Russians filled the border gates of countries that did not require visas, such as Georgia and Armenia. The remaining Russian citizens continue their protests against the mobilization from where they left off. Most citizens in Russia fear being sent to fight in Ukraine. The Russian citizens who shouted that they did not want to die in Ukraine did not delay the intervention. Russian leader Vladimir Putin has detained the citizens who participated in the protests across the country through the Russian police. Across Russia, there are currently close to 5,500 Russian citizens arrested for participating in anti-mobilization protests. Despite Putin's power, his influence on the Russians gradually diminished, while Zelensky's power and influence on the Russians began to increase. While the situation in Russia was like this, the Ukrainian armed forces made a striking development. The line of surrender called I Want to Live, initiated by the Ukrainian armed forces, which is in first place on the world agenda, alarmed the Russian administration. The surrender line, initiated by Zelensky for thousands of Russian soldiers who do not want to go to Ukraine due to the mobilization decision, seems to bring a solution. The Russian administration, on the other hand, has already entered the period of collapse and is wandering the streets to find soldiers for the Russian army. Now, Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who is panicking with the line of surrender called I Want to Live, that the Ukrainian armed forces have issued, wants to prevent escapes from Russia. The surrender line of the Ukrainian armed forces against Russian citizens who do not want to join the Russian army with the mobilization decision and who oppose the war attracted the attention of thousands of Russian citizens. With the surrender line application called I Want to Live, the Ukrainian armed forces announced that Russian citizens are not obliged to Putin's torture regime, and that Russian citizens can save their lives by surrendering to the Ukrainian administration whenever they want. This service provided by the Ukrainian armed forces to the Russians has received very serious figures so far. This practice, which alarms Putin and the Kremlin, ensures the surrender of 25,000 Russian soldiers or separatists to Ukraine. Following this development, Russian leader Vladimir Putin announced that he would increase criminal sanctions against Russian citizens who surrendered to Ukraine. Announcing that Russian citizens who attempt to surrender to the Ukrainian armed forces in any way will be sentenced up to 10 years in prison, the dictator Vladimir Putin continues to terrorize his country by doing his best. But it was too late. Russian citizens had already saved their lives by surrendering to the Ukrainian armed forces. The Ukrainian armed forces, on the other hand, stated that unlike the dictator leader Vladimir Putin, the provisions of the Geneva Convention will be applied to Russian citizens who surrender. Announcing that Russian citizens who surrender will be given 3 regular meals a day, they will be able to communicate with their families and their lives will be safe. The Ukrainian armed forces stated that the calls from Russian citizens are getting more and more every day. The personal information of the 25,000 Russian soldiers expected to surrender to the Ukrainian armed forces is kept confidential by the Ukrainian administration. Even the Ukrainian government cannot turn a blind eye to the oppression and torture regime that has followed the mobilization decision in Russia. The Ukrainian state administration and Ukrainian President Zelensky, who think more about the Russian citizens than Vladimir Putin, emphasized that Russian citizens who surrender need not to be afraid and that the Ukrainian government guarantees the lives of Russian citizens who surrender no matter what. Among the applicants to the line called I Want to Live, issued by the Ukrainian armed forces, high-ranking Russian officers who no longer believe in war draw attention, usually on the southern fronts of Donetsk, Kharkiv, and Ukraine. The number of senior Russian officers who applied to the surrender line and soldiers fighting on the Ukrainian fronts reached a record 18,000. Apart from the Russian soldiers, there are also many anti-mobilization Russian citizens looking for this line of surrender. The Russian local people, fed up with Putin's repression management, want to find the solution in the Ukrainian armed forces. It's observed that applicants to the surrender line called I Want to Live have increased rapidly, especially after the gains in the southern region of Ukraine. Russian soldiers prefer to take refuge in the Ukrainian armed forces rather than fight and die in Ukraine. On the day of the explosion at the Crimean Kerch Bridge, a record number of calls reached the surrender line put into practice by the Ukrainian armed forces. On the same day as the explosion on the bridge, the number of Russian citizens calling Ukraine's surrender line was more than double what had happened at the time. In short, the Russians started a collective surrender movement. According to the provisions of the mobilization decree declared by Vladimir Putin, Russian citizens who meet military standards are obliged to join the Russian army and go to Ukraine. As for military standards, Russian Defense Minister Shoigu stated that Russian citizens who have military experience and meet the criteria will be selected first, and those who do not meet the military criteria will not be mobilized. But right after the Russian defense minister's statement, Russian Guard regiments went on a manhunt on the streets of Russia. Among the citizens mobilized by the Russian Guard regiments were elderly individuals with chronic illnesses, full-time university students, and many Russian citizens who did not meet the military criteria. Russian local people protested on the streets of Russia for days against this system implemented by the Moscow administration. Russian citizens marched to the administration buildings with mobilization and anti-Putin banners in their hands. Russian leader Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin administration can no longer prevent escapes from Russia. Thanks to the excellent application of the Ukrainian armed forces surrender line called I Want to Live, it gives the Russians a chance to re-establish a life. Vladimir Putin, on the other hand, is considering where to find the 300,000 volunteers currently scheduled to be mobilized into the Russian army. Citizens in the country of Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who adopted the rule of oppression and violence, could no longer stand these policies. Russian citizens, already intimidated by the mobilization decision, took refuge in the Ukrainian armed forces because, in the first statements of Russian Defense Minister Shoigu about mobilization, it was stated that 300,000 volunteers could increase to 1 million in accordance with Article 7. The Russian administration, which applied the provisions of mobilization in their own way, caused the people to fear and worry. Even professional Russian soldiers who are in the Russian army and are currently fighting in Ukraine do not want to fight. They demand this bloodshed to stop. Russian citizens, including Russian soldiers, no longer trust Vladimir Putin or the Kremlin administration. Trying to show the course of the Ukrainian war in favor of Russia, Putin can no longer deceive his people. Russian leader Putin has lost his reputation, not only in the eyes of his people but also in the world political arena. Recently, Vladimir Putin decided to annex 4 regions of Ukraine with an official ceremony, announcing that Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions belong to Russia with a so-called referendum. Vladimir Putin surprised the whole world. Just 24 hours after these striking statements of the Russian leader, the Ukrainian heroes took back the city of Liman, which was included in the so-called annexation borders from the Russians. Liman, which was a very serious shipping point for the Russians, was cleared of the invading troops as a result of the operations organized by the Ukrainian valiants. The first event in which Russian leader Vladimir Putin was disgraced was recorded as the liberation of the city of Liman by Ukrainian heroes. And this incident was not enough to put the Russian leader in the ground. Ukrainian heroes infiltrated Kherson, continuing their dawn operations. The Ukrainian Lions, who captured the cities under Russian domination in this region, managed to fly the Ukrainian flag in Kherson. In the face of all these developments, Russian leader Vladimir Putin could no longer find an explanation to make. The annexation decision of the Russian leader, who is disgraced to the world, for the 4 regions of Ukraine has fallen into an invalid position. This so-called annexation decision, which is not currently recognized by any world state, remained another illegal attempt by the Russian administration. Judging by the events of this week, the Russian administration's empire of oppression and fear is likely to drive Russian citizens out of the country altogether. It is claimed that the helpless Russian leader Putin will give end signals because he will not be able to find soldiers for the last Ukrainian front. We will see together what the next process will bring us. Stay cool for now. Don't forget to follow our channel to be aware of hot developments by turning on notifications.